everyone. I am so sorry that the audio was unfortunately not working on the videos yesterday. I don't know what happened that resulted in it not working, but I'm going to try to go through all the videos again and hopefully it cooperates with me. So without further ado, let me address what I really wanted to address for this underrated film Saturday, and that is The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and I'm discussing the Disney version. Because that one I think seems to be thrown under the bus for I think a variety of reasons. One being its time period. It did come out post-Renaissance period. I mean, it was a time when Disney was sort of at, I guess you could say, troughing as far as the popularity of their films. It was sort of in a decline. And also, I think this film's subject matter in particular is rather dark for a children's film, in particular a Disney film for that matter. And I think that is a major contributing factor into why not a whole lot of people really went and saw this film. Now, the interesting thing that, or at least an interesting experience that I've had with this film is that it was probably the first Disney film that I actually saw in theaters. Only because I was actually old enough to go into a movie theater and kind of maybe at least comprehend a little bit of what was going on. And I did not like this movie actually initially when I saw it because it freaked me out a lot when I was a kid. And I think for good reason, because there's a lot of creepy things that happen in this film for a 4-year-old to sit through. uh, so, um, so I think that's something that I think really did result in the film's unpopularity. But despite that, I think it is actually, now looking at it as an adult, I can say that this one is, I think, um, probably not only the most underrated of the post-Disney Renaissance, or even Disney in general, but it is also one that I think is probably the best um, as far as quality is concerned. When you look at a lot of the other post Renaissance Disney films, um, and I think also another major contributing factor into this film not being necessarily as popular is not only the dark and grim aspects of it, but even the comedy doesn't seem to gel all too well with these dark undertones that it has throughout. So I can understand that that's a major flaw. But I think when you really look at it through a broader perspective, a lot of the things that are done within this film and how they are executed are really interesting and actually rather unique for Disney and for animation in general. Um, and in case anybody has not seen this film or really heard the story of Quasimodo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, basically, uh, the Disney version follows sort of Quasimodo, the hunchback, wanting to pursue a life outside of the bell towers in which he's sort of born and raised and confined into by the villain of the film, Cloud Frollo. And you eventually see how um, Quasimodo tries to sort of get out into the real world, and he comes across a bunch of colorful characters, and um, eventually his sort of odyssey leads to conflicts, and there's a lot of commentary onto various things that were going on, sort of, I guess you could even say, during the time, and things that I think even Victor Hugo addressed within the book, but Disney tries to emphasize certain aspects that exist within the story, but are not as um, but are maybe not as reinforced or kind of even downplayed within the story. So again, Disney kind of went with a variety of different uh, choices, and in doing so, they actually, I think, did an overall uh, well done job for what this story is really based on, which is a rather kind of grim and not as optimistic or as uplifting story. So, um, with that, the important thing I think to note when it comes to this film is that the animation is stellar. I think that the you really do get a sense of the environment and um, the scale of the Church of Notre Dame, and um, the music that goes along with it is also gorgeous and consistent to the time period um, in which this story takes place within the Middle Ages, and it's uh it's very well done from a character standpoint, like trying to make Quasimodo this sort of likable, innocent um, character, and probably one of the most standout villains comes from this film in particular, Cloud Frollo, when you really look at Disney's lineup of villains, because he does have a certain amount of depth to him, and and the thing is Disney really addresses a very no kind of subject matter that usually you don't see in kids films, and the way in which they do it is not only very adult, but it is very interesting in that they really do um, give you a sense of the turmoil even of the villain. So it really adds an extra layer of depth, and I find that very fascinating, and it's just something that you don't really see all that often within children's films, and I thought it was just really well done and overall well paced. And although sometimes I think the humor does kind of work, especially when they're kind of trying to kind of brush off the dark elements that are, kind of within the film. Obviously, the biggest kind of elephant in the room when it comes to how um, not so well executed this of a film this is, according to some people, is the gargoyles. And yes, I will say the gargoyles are a huge, huge uh, hole as far as this film is concerned. Like it's almost like looking at a painting, and then noticing that there's just this big hole in it, or there's just this kind of big smudge. Everything else looks so nice and well executed, and then you see this smudge here, and that's kind of just the gargoyles. I mean, they're not horrible, I think, by any stretch of the imagination, but they do offer something that is not needed within this film. And if anything, I think had they made it more a sort of imagination of Quasimodo's as opposed to being kind of inserted as part of the plot and, really playing a pivotal role into his psyche. Yeah, I think that's really not needed. They just kind of just need to be there for some entertainment value, and unfortunately, they don't really provide that, and they do kind of ruin some parts of this film. I'm not gonna lie, they just insert themselves where they don't need to be inserted in. So yeah, I think that's really a big part too of what discouraged people was the fact that you had this very beautifully well executed film, and then you got this big dud in the middle of it that is pretty much throughout, and is something that is, you almost just kind of have to forward through in order to really get to the things that are really actually interesting and unique and thinking outside of the box. So yeah, I can understand why people would complain about these characters in particular, and that they would be a discouragement from people actually genuinely enjoying the film. But I think when you really look at how the plot is structured, how the characters are structured overall, although some things are a little bit underdeveloped, when you look at it as a whole, that's really it's really something that I think is worthy of looking into and is really worth recommendation. And again, I can see why that there are these kinds of major issues as far as, you know, character choices and creativity, sort of, uh, licensing, so to speak, as far as to what kind of comedy was going to be in this film. But I think when you look at everything else from a character and plot standpoint, it's it's really well crafted. I mean, it's obviously not perfect, and I wouldn't compare this to the Renaissance films only because this is obviously within a different era of Disney, and Disney was obviously trying to experiment with things. And I think what I admire about this film is the fact that it did take these risks. It did try to kind of go over that line that people try to sort of draw within the sand when it comes to children's films. And I think, it took some steps over it. And obviously, I don't think a lot of children, including myself, genuinely liked it. But then when we get older and we see the amount of creativity and amount of depth to it, we really do grow to appreciate it, and we're not really afraid of it anymore, so to speak. Um, it's like that roller coaster that you went on when you were, I don't know, 5, and you were freaked out and you're like, I'm never going to go on this ride again. And then next, like when you're in your teenage years, you suddenly decide to go back on it, and it's like the best exhilarating experience of your life. That's kind of the feeling I think a lot of people can attribute to this film, especially if you did grow up in the 90s and, you kind of really did end up eventually really growing up within sort of the post Renaissance films, which was largely my childhood because although I do remember the Renaissance films, they weren't really theatrical releases when I was of age to really go and view them. So, so I think it's just something that's uh, very important to note when it comes to this particular film and its sort of, I think, significance is that it went out there and tried to do something different. And in doing so, some of those risks ultimately were maybe not the most productive decisions, but in others, you really do see the amount of effort and energy put into them. So I would definitely recommend this film. Um, it obviously isn't perfect and it's got its flaws, but I think when you look at it as a whole, there's a lot to be enjoyed, and I think a lot of that enjoyment goes, I think, underappreciated. So that's why I would definitely put this film within the underrated category. However, I think that's really ultimately all I can say. Hopefully this video works and doesn't have any audio issues, but if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.